Kia ora koutou, everybody. Just a number of things to update you on in regards to managed isolation and quarantine this week. You'll have seen that our regular updates on the in and out flows from the facilities on the COVID website, and no doubt you're all poring over those daily. From tomorrow, we'll be adding an incident section to the daily report, and this will cover incidents of a public health interest that occur inside the managed isolation and quarantine facilities. So far, as you'll see from those sheets, that 81 cases of COVID have been detected in the facilities through the robust containment and testing procedures that we have in place. These are the measures, of course, that are keeping the team of 5 million safe, and we remain one of the few countries in the world to be enjoying the extraordinary social and economic freedoms we have in a world where COVID is growing and not slowing. Last week, Air Commodore Webb and I visited Invercargill, Queenstown and Dunedin to assess whether facilities with the right safety measures could be set up to keep any incoming COVID cases contained at the border in those regions. As you will have seen, at the end of last week, we ruled out Invercargill and Queenstown, and at this stage, we are not proceeding with Dunedin either. We'd like to personally thank the leaders we spoke with across the Otago and Southland regions for their positive and proactive support during our planning and feasibility assessments. The safety of New Zealanders is paramount. Managed isolation facilities must meet certain criteria to accommodate people for a 14-day stay. Ensuring that we keep demand and supply in lockstep has continued to be a critical focus for us this week. Given the complexity of operating these facilities to the high standard that is required to keep cases of COVID firmly contained at the border, we've been working with the Ministry of Transport, airlines and airports to further smooth the numbers of incoming people. We've also been working on a system to allocate people to accommodation in managed isolation facilities. The most appropriate way to do this is to link passage home to an allocated place. Work is progressing in this area and it's expected to be operational next month. The Ministry of Transport is working with airlines operating commercial flights into New Zealand to amend their licences to allow for a rolling 2-week quota over a specified period for each airline, which will align demand and supply. This measure will provide an important additional defence against COVID-19 by ensuring the demand on our managed isolation and quarantine facilities from those returning does not exceed the safe levels of capacity that we have established. The exemptions process for people leaving managed isolation early in circumstances is now operational. 7 people have been granted exemptions in the last week. And I'll now hand over to Air Commodore Webb.
Thank you, Minister. As of today, we've seen 30,475 New Zealanders return home and go through managed isolation and quarantine since the 26th of March. Our current capacity is provided by 32 managed isolation and quarantine facilities across 5 regions. In the past 3 weeks, we've increased effective capacity by over a third. Nonetheless, based on the criteria for isolation facilities set by the Ministry of Health, we assess that we are now close to exhausting our nationwide available capacity. As the Minister mentioned, over the last month we have been working hard on the demand side of our system in order to create a predictable and manageable flow of returning New Zealanders. The Minister has outlined that at this stage we won't be opening any facilities in Dunedin. The community spirit and health capacity certainly supported the concept. Unfortunately, as we've previously mentioned, each facility and particular location has its own characteristics, and the available options in Dunedin presented complex safety and logistical challenges that simply exceeded the benefits that they would provide. On the incoming flow of returning New Zealanders, our interim management mechanisms will be based on providing airlines with a 14-day rolling average of returnees. This will give airlines the maximum flexibility to manage public demand and their own operational planning requirements. Alongside these operational improvements to the inbound flow of returnees, as the Minister outlined, we've also made important changes to the managed isolation exemption process. We now have a trained and resourced team on site made up of all of government staff and able to tap into health advice. We've developed an end-to-end transport and compliance system. We think this system effectively balances the need to ensure that COVID doesn't spread in the community against the very real and unique circumstances that face everyday New Zealanders coming home. Transport will consist of medical support where necessary, or suitably equipped and staffed vehicles for other exemption cases. Conditions of release are central to managing the public health safety risk, and we have resources in place to ensure these conditions are met and any follow-up isolation requirements are adhered to. We expect to go live with a new website and web application form in the next fortnight. The focus will be on ensuring that people have good information up front about whether they might meet the very limited conditions to be considered for an exemption prior to making any decision about travel. In the meantime, people can contact isolation exemptions at mbie.govt.nz, and this email is staffed 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. Thank you, Minister.
Questions?
Is there a risk in allowing these compassionate exemptions, and how will you ensure the same mistakes won't happen again?
So I'll give a very brief overview of that, and then I'm sure Air Commodore Webb can get into some detail of that. But one of the things that we have been doing over the period of time that we've been in charge of this, of course, we paused the exemptions process so a more robust system could be stood up. There are a number of criteria. One of those is around compliance and ensuring that there is adherence to a strict set of rules that need to be put in place to make sure that we are protecting New Zealanders' health and the gains that we have made, because fundamentally this is what it is about. But we do recognise that there are some exceptional circumstances, but they are just that, exceptional circumstances. But I'll hand over to Air Commodore Webb to go through some of the measures we've put in place there.
Yeah, I'd just reinforce that point. We've made it pains to state that exception is exceptional, and the criteria, as was originally set right back at the start, continues to be a key criteria. There is a health-based application form which runs through a range of assessment steps, which gives those experts an understanding of what the likely risk to the public might be. That's the first process. Then it's a consideration of, is this case exceptional? 14 days in a managed isolation continues to be the most important first line of defence. So regardless of anybody's personal view that they can stay at home, for example, that's not the view held for public health safety.
A demand for those requests to go up now that people aren't so afraid of community transmission, since it's been such a long time since we've had it?
So in terms of the demand, we've set up a process, but they will of course be scrutinised against a very clear set of criteria of what will constitute an exceptional circumstance. So demand may go up for applications, but in terms of the way in which they're decided, there is a threshold that has to be met, and that is about recognising where there are a handful of individuals that do have very exceptional circumstances that for some reason or another may need to be released before the 14 days. One of the things that has changed is that won't necessarily be you're released early. It may be you're released to, for example, go and visit a loved one who is dying, but then come back to the facility. So there are a variety of measures in place. So even if demand were to occur, the criteria ensures that the number one priority for us is ensuring that this 14-day isolation period stays as the critical line of defence for New Zealanders' health and the gains that we've made.
In terms of this 14-day rolling average for airlines and things, that is explicitly to ensure that we don't get close to reaching capacity. We will probably never ever have a situation where there will be more people on the tarmac than we have space for.
Absolutely. The number one job that we recognised that we needed to do when we took this over 5 weeks ago now was actually making sure that we were having demand and supply in absolute lockstep. We described it as a system that was under stress. Initially when we took it over, that it was very much a demand-driven system, and supply was having to chase to catch up with that. What we want to ensure is that we have a very clear idea of what our safe isolation facilities are, and that we're matching demand to that supply, because we've got to ensure that we are keeping New Zealanders safe. So, in answer to your question, the systems we're setting up will ensure that we are not having demand exceed supply.
Do you have a sort of an ideal amount of headroom there that you're leaving?
Look, there'll have to be some. I mean, we've had a number of instances, which I'm sure Air Commodore Webb can speak more about, but things to factor in when you're using air transport like fog. That means that you can't locate some individuals where you were planning to. We had one instance on a Saturday night of a whole plane load of people who were going to be domiciled in Christchurch, but the flight couldn't go from Auckland to Christchurch. So for that reason, there has to be some headroom.
Yeah, I can speak to those details if you like. We're aiming for 90% maximum capacity, and for the reasons the Minister's exactly described. It's not possible to predict with absolute certainty exactly who's going to come into New Zealand. We've seen the volatility in the system to date, and in addition, we need to ensure that, say we have another fire alarm that goes off and we have to evacuate a full hotel, fog situations. So anything like that, we need to have an ability to hold some overflow, and that just seems to make sense to us.
And just to add to that, the complexity of the system is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the kind of ratio we work of people to rooms is 1.3. People. But I mean, for instance, there was one plane load of people that came in which was largely full of single travellers, which actually does throw those ratios out a bit. So there is a huge complexity that has to be accounted for.
Can you clarify what the maximum capacity is, or what do you expect it to be once you've sort of searched every facility?
So the 14-day forecast for total planned capacity, and that is facilities that we have contracted and have, so that they're certain, is 6,935.
And you're not expecting it to actually increase more than that? You've sort of investigated every facility? Yeah,
we're close to that. The criteria is set by health, and it is a tight criteria, and what we see now is we are getting to the point where those locations carry additional characteristics which require additional mitigation, and we're just weighing up at what point do you say it's no longer beneficial to continue to grow. In addition, of course, as I mentioned before, each of these locations requires wraparound support and the necessary health support. So 32 facilities, that's a significant portfolio, and right now for where we're at, we are suggesting that's about the maximum that we want to deal with.
And I just want to put that capacity into context. So around 7,000 in the next fortnight. So over a month, that is 14,000 with the 14-day periods that are required. Put that into context that we've so far since the 26th of March, had 30,475. So we're saying each month we'd be able to accommodate nearly half of that again. This is a large number of New Zealanders who will be able to safely return home while we simultaneously maintain that strong line of defence for New Zealand, protecting our health and the gains that we have made.
And can you give an example of what of the threshold of the compassionate leave is? So how high is that bar?
We've had, just in the last period, we've had 138 inquiries for release, and this is just all exemption release. What that might be is an email contact with asking questions. It might not necessarily translate into an actual application. When you factor that down into the number of applications, which is considerably less than that, in the last week, as the Minister said, we've seen 7. And so when you think about the number of applications, which is probably in the order of around 50, we're saying somewhere between 10 and 15% would be turned into a positive supported application process.
And
What were the timings for that period of the application?
That's over the last week.
And so are those 7 that were granted, were they for things such as visiting a dying relative?
These ones were largely medical in nature, so Medivac and medical exemptions.
But moving forward, is that the threshold of where an application would be granted?
I think it's key to note that every single one is quite unique and will be dealt with on its own merits. As I've said, there is a really clearly laid out process in terms of what needs to be considered from whether it's a health-based criteria, whether it's an exemption in actual fact, and then how we're going to deal with the assurance, transport and compliance part. It's necessarily a high bar, and so that sort of ratio, we believe, matches the need to keep the public safety paramount versus the dealing with individual compassionate or essential criteria.
So it's not just a narrow health criteria that will be used, just to be absolutely crystal clear on that.
Has there had any updated advice or any legal advice around charging people for quarantine?
Yes, continuing to work on that, and we'll have more to say very soon.
Has there been a regime worked out about how to regularly test people who are working in these facilities? And at the minute, the Director General said that was being worked through still.
That is work that is progressing. That one of the things that we have observed when we've visited, I think it's around 7 or 8 of these isolation facilities now, is actually some of the comfort that a number of the staff have by having access to regular testing across all the staff, whether that be the health staff or the security staff or the hotel workers, the cleaners and the cooks that are working in the hotels, that some of them express to us a great deal of comfort of being able to have regular access to testing, just so they, when they're going home, that they could have that added level of certainty. Of course, all the practices are in place to ensure there aren't close contacts within the hotels, but if it's an extra layer of comfort for the staff, it's something positive, and that is work that is progressing.
What's the delay? Why is it taking so long to get that regime in place?
Oh, look, that's an issue for health in terms of the testing regimes, but in terms of the what we've fed through into that is very much what we've heard on the ground from those workers in those facilities who really are a new front line in our fight against COVID. It's the people in those hotels that are keeping all of us safe and making sure that we are having those 14 days of managed isolation for those returning New Zealand citizens and permanent residents. So we've fed through very clearly what it is we've heard from those workers on the ground.
How long the contract the government has with these facilities? What's to stop them from saying in a few weeks or a few months if tourism pops back that they'd like to go back to their old jobs?
We have 6-month contracts with the hotels, if that was the question. Yeah, so 6-monthly contracts gives certainty to the hotel industry, and our engagement with them, which has been strong and consistent over the last few months, has indicated that that's a comfortable place for them to be. Clearly, they're weighing up whether or not they go open market and seek a reduced occupancy rate, or 100% exclusive use occupancy rates for the 6-month period. And at this stage, it's working well.
The government created, though, this system of hotels in the midst of a crisis. Has more thought been given to perhaps looking at an alternate way of handling returnees, seeing as this program seems to be indefinite?
Yes, we have looked at what other facilities may be available. One of the complexities of this, of all the helpful suggestions that are usually thrown up by people, don't meet the health criteria. A lot of those are institutional type facilities that don't have, for example, individual bathrooms. That's one of the very clear health criteria that needs to be there, that people aren't sharing ablutions. So we are continued to be open to options other than hotels, and that's of course part of the longer term piece of work that we are doing.
The booking system, you said was going to be operational in the next month. Is that how long people can expect for the international flight hold to be in place?
We've been working with Air New Zealand and the Ministry of Transport in the last few days, and this 14-day managed quota, rolling quota period can be implemented very quickly. So what our advice to Air New Zealand is actually there's no need now to put a halt on the ticketing regime, and they can re-implement their ability for people to ticket. We're suggesting actually that bringing forward people's booked and planned travel that's a week or two out forward would be something that would work well for us, and then them knowing exactly how many seats they have to fill over that 14-day period really puts the ball in their court. This is something that airlines do. That's what their job is. They solve challenges in terms of seats and people, and they're best placed to solve that. So I think that we're really excited about how that's going to work into the next next month or so.
Law experts are saying that charging New Zealanders for isolation could be a breach of treaty obligations for Māori. What's your response to that, and is that something you've taken into consideration?
Look, we are considering a range of legal advice, and no final decisions have been made, and we'll have more to say on that later.
Potentially be a group that would be exempt from paying fees?
Look, we will have more to say on any issues around charging for managed isolation facilities at a later date.
Do you have any forecasts around people who might want to return from Australia, especially as the situation there gets much worse
Well,
COVID?
what we do know is there's something like 400,000 to 600,000 New Zealanders, New Zealand citizens and permanent residents who are currently living in Australia. That's the bulk of New Zealanders who are living offshore, somewhere between 600 and 900,000 New Zealanders who don't live in New Zealand. In terms of the forecasts of how many of those may want to return, that's asking us how long a piece of string is. I think a lot of that will be dependent on how the situation in Australia continues to develop. Of course, people's continued employment is a critical part of their decision of whether or not to stay, given they don't have access to income support if they're not an Australian citizen.
Do you accept that you might need to actually look at other options, even if they aren't that ideal, in terms of hotels, given the people in Australia might want to return, and also international students, there might be a push to get them back?
So the only thing that would make a hotel not ideal is it not fulfilling the health criteria. We as a government are committed to retaining the strong line of defence at our border to ensure that we can protect New Zealanders' health. We can, we won't experience the surges that other countries are seeing at the moment, and we can protect the gains we have made. I started off talking about how we are enjoying some of the most freedoms, economic and social, of anybody in the world, and they were hard-won freedoms. We made an extreme sacrifice to get to this point, and it is our responsibility to make sure that we have strong lines of defence at our borders. So in terms of the criteria that health have set around ensuring that these hotels are fit for purpose and they are doing what they are supposed to do, and that is managed isolation so that we can keep New Zealand free of COVID, that has to be our number one consideration.
Do you say that New Zealanders overseas who are maybe feeling a bit scared or shut out by hearing that there's going to be a 14-day quota of how many can come home?
Oh, look, I think if you have a look at the fact that we've had 30,000 New Zealanders return since the 26th of March and that they've gone through managed isolation, we're talking about being able to have nearly half that amount every month in our managed isolation facilities. That needs to be a managed flow. Managed isolation needs to be just that. Bear in mind, most of these New Zealanders want to come home because of the New Zealand they are coming to. One that is COVID-free, one where they can enjoy the freedoms, both economic and social, that they can't enjoy in the places they currently are. And in order to protect that, we have to make sure that we have safe and managed isolation facilities.
For planning purposes for the export education sector, do you think that they need to accept that in the first trimester next year, foreign students probably won't be able to come to New Zealand?
Oh, look, I think it's too early to say that. Of course, a lot of this is dependent. Most of our flows of people coming into our managed isolation facilities are, of course, coming from Australia. If we do get to a point where there can be a trans-Tasman bubble, that changes everything, obviously. Continuing to work with all of my colleagues who have sectors that want to see the borders reopen around how that might be facilitated when the time is right. But I can hear the bells. One last question.
Sorry, is the government going to proactively release every day the breakdown of the testing so we can see how many from these managed isolation versus community testing?
Oh, look, that would be, in terms of what we release in the Managed Isolation and Facilities report, how many tests have occurred within the managed isolation facilities. So you can obviously look at that against the data that health releases. But I think I'm not sure if health does break down to place and facility, but certainly how many tests have happened in a facility are in the Managed Isolation and Facilities report released daily. But thank you very much.